On a muggy August morning in 1855, a boy was put up for sale on an auction block in Savannah, Georgia, yet not a single prospective buyer showed interest. His very pale skin and light-colored eyes made him seem cursed, dangerous, and a source of misfortune that no plantation owner wanted to risk introducing to their property. The bidding started at $20, then dropped to $15s and then to $10. Finally, at a mere $5, one woman subtly signaled her bid. Margaret Denore, a widow who owned 4,000 acres about 12 miles outside the city, paid $12, claiming it was an act of Christian charity. The onlookers commended her generosity. They were unaware that Margaret had been actively seeking a child exactly like him for the past 3 years. What they could not have conceived was that 73 individuals would vanish on her estate over the following 14 years. Their fates were allegedly recorded in ledgers that local authorities reportedly incinerated in 1861. However, one ledger survived, hidden inside a foundation wall and discovered during highway construction in 1959. Inside, it contained measurements, bloodline charts, and details about something called the Purification Project. Before continuing with the story of the albino boy and the hidden compound where Margaret carried out her experiments, I need to ask you to subscribe to this channel and activate the notification bell. As we reveal the secrets that history tried to conceal, please also leave a comment indicating your state or city, so we know where our audience is hearing these chilling tales. Now let me transport you back to that oppressive afternoon when a widow's horrifying plan started to take form. The summer heat in Savannah was physically intense, bearing down on the crowd assembled near the waterfront slave market. Margaret Denore arrived in her carriage, alone as usual, a large woman whose presence commanded attention during a time when such a physique suggested affluence and influence. At age 47, she had been a widow for 13 years, managing her late husband's plantation with a steely determination that unsettled overseers and made neighbors cautious. But Margaret's most distinguishing feature wasn't her appearance or her business acumen. It was the library she had built over the last decade. Over 300 books on natural philosophy, anatomy, and animal husbandry, with a strong emphasis on breeding techniques and hereditary science. The boy brought to the platform that day was perhaps 11 years old, so thin his ribs were visible through his shirt, but it was his distinct coloring that silenced the crowd. His skin appeared nearly transparent in the harsh sunlight. His hair was white blonde and thin, and his eyes had a pinkish-gray tint that seemed to look through people rather than at them. The auctioneer, a professional named Cyrus Peaton, struggled to conceal his unease. Lot 47, he announced with less than his usual fervor. Male child, approximately 11 years old, from the Hutchinson estate near Augusta. As you can see, he has a peculiar affliction, albinism. The term wasn't spoken directly, but everyone understood. In Georgia in 1855, such children carried significant superstitious weight among both white and enslaved communities. Many believed they caused crop failures, could see ghosts, or were marked by divine punishment. The combination of African and European heritage was common enough on plantations, but albinism created an uncomfortable ambiguity that challenged the racial classifications upon which the entire system was founded. When the initial bid was set at $20, no one raised a hand. Peaton progressively lowered it until he reached $5, still silence. People turned away, some making gestures to ward off evil. That was when Margaret raised her fan with calculated slowness, her expression composed. $5 to Mrs. Denore, Peaton quickly stated, relieved to have any bid. Going once, going twice, sold. Margaret then stood, theatrically opening her purse. I will pay $12 for the poor child, she declared loudly. It is our Christian duty to care for those whom others reject. Several women approvingly nodded. An older gentleman called out, God bless you, Mrs. Denore. She accepted the praise with a gracious smile, presenting the perfect image of benevolent Christianity. However, as the boy was escorted to her carriage, her eyes analyzed him with the same cold precision of a scientist inspecting a rare specimen. She had finally located what she needed. Subject 0 for her purification project. The boy, whose previous owners had named him Thomas, sat tightly pressed into the corner of the carriage during the drive to Belmont Plantation. Margaret remained silent with him, instead opening a leather journal and beginning to record observations. His estimated age, the specific tone of his skin and hair, the color of his eyes under different light conditions, and the dimensions of his hands and feet. She worked systematically, occasionally glancing up to measure him with her gaze before returning to her notes. Augustus, Margaret's driver, had served the Dunor family for over 2 decades. His shoulders were strained, his jaw clenched. He had learned years ago not to question Margaret's actions. Belmont had a menacing reputation among the enslaved population in Chatham County. People went there and simply disappeared, not having escaped, as news of runaways being caught usually circulated. These individuals simply ceased to exist as if they had never been born. The carriage traveled through the pine forest towards a section of Belmont that Thomas would soon become intimately familiar with. A group of buildings was concealed nearly a mile from the main house, accessible only by a narrow track cutting through dense woods. These structures were built between 1843 and 1852, using materials bought in small amounts from various suppliers across 3 states. The laborers who constructed them were immediately sold after completion, scattered to plantations so distant they would never meet to share their stories. When Augustus stopped the carriage in front of the largest building, Margaret descended and signaled for Thomas to follow. The interior was unlike anything he had ever encountered. Clean pine floors, whitewashed walls, glass windows. Margaret led him to a small room containing a bed with an actual mattress, a chair, a table with a basin and a shelf. "This will be your room," she stated, her cultured voice devoid of warmth. "You will receive adequate food, clothing, and shelter. In exchange, you will cooperate with specific procedures, medical examinations, measurements, observations. Do you understand?" Thomas nodded, understanding only that survival required obedience. "Can you read?" He shook his head. "Can you write?" Another negative shake. "You will be taught," Margaret stated with satisfaction. "You will learn to read, write, and understand natural philosophy. These lessons begin tomorrow. You may ask questions about your lessons, but you will not ask questions about anything else you see or hear. You will not speak to others without permission. You will not attempt to leave. If you obey, you will be treated well. If you disobey, punishments will be severe. Do you understand?" Thomas nodded again, his thin body shaking. Margaret secured the door from the outside as she departed. Thomas remained still for a long time before eventually sitting on the edge of the mattress. He couldn't bring himself to lie down. Instead, he sat with his back against the wall, knees pulled to his chest, awaiting whatever was next. In the cool basement of another structure, Margaret ignited oil lamps and opened a journal. She dipped her pen in ink and began writing in a neat, precise hand. August 17, 1855. Subject 0 has arrived at Belmont. Initial observations suggest excellent quality for the purification project. Pure albinism evident in all physical characteristics. Begin preliminary measurements tomorrow, followed by educational assessment. Subject 0 served as the fundamental starting point upon which all subsequent stages of the project would be constructed. If her hypotheses were validated, this acquisition confirmed 13 years of planning. She continued her writing for another 60 minutes, meticulously recording every detail she observed about Thomas. In Margaret's mind, he wasn't a human being. He was the essential component for revealing what she believed were the secrets of human heredity. She would devote the next 4 years to preparing him for a role so appalling that its eventual disclosure would forever haunt Chatham County. Thomas's days at Belmont were governed by an inflexible routine that Margaret maintained with perfect consistency. He awoke every morning at 6 dawn when Margaret herself unlocked his door, a habit she kept to underscore her total authority. She would enter with a measuring tape and a journal, marking his height against the doorframe. Once a week she weighed him on a scale imported from Philadelphia. Once a month, she conducted a comprehensive physical exam lasting over an hour, measuring every facet of his physical development with clinical exactness. Following the morning measurements, Thomas was served breakfast, cornmeal mush occasionally supplemented with milk or molasses. Margaret had calculated the precise caloric intake required for optimal growth. At 7, his instruction commenced. Margaret had engaged a tutor, an anxious young man from Savannah named Christopher Vance, who visited twice weekly to teach reading, writing, and arithmetic. Vance was under the impression that he was participating in progressive research to assess the academic capabilities of enslaved children. He had no awareness of Margaret's true wider project. Thomas proved to be an exceptional pupil, grasping information with remarkable speed. By the conclusion of his first year, he could read complex literature, write with clear penmanship, and solve advanced mathematical problems. Margaret appeared satisfied, although her approval was expressed as clinical endorsement rather than genuine affection. She assigned him books from her library, anatomical texts with detailed diagrams, agricultural guides on livestock breeding, and natural philosophy works discussing inheritance and variation. However, the ultimate purpose of his education became apparent during Margaret's private lessons. She would sit opposite Thomas in one of the compound schoolrooms with anatomy charts displayed between them and articulate her theories. She demonstrated how traits were passed from parents to offspring, presented charts detailing horse breeding, and explained how desirable characteristics could be intensified through careful selection. She would then switch without altering her tone to human heredity. She laid out her conviction that different races represented distinct developmental phases, and that qualities like intelligence and beauty were inherited and could be improved through selective breeding. Thomas listened with an expressionless face, his pale eyes fixed on the charts. He had learned that asking questions resulted in severe reprimands. Margaret never physically harmed him. She didn't need to. The isolation and the absolute control she wielded were sufficient punishment. He was permitted contact only with Margaret, Vance, and occasionally Augustus, who delivered supplies but never spoke more than what was strictly necessary. What Thomas did not yet fully grasp was the specific role Margaret was grooming him for. She was educating him not out of progressive principles, but because she needed him to fully comprehend what would eventually be expected of him. She required him to understand heredity, to know why specific pairings yielded certain results, and to appreciate the profound significance of her experiment, because eventually, once he reached maturity, he would transition from merely being an object of study to an active participant in creating what Margaret called her improved line. The compound held other individuals besides Thomas, though he seldom saw them. Through his window, he occasionally saw people moving between the buildings under guard. He sometimes heard voices muffled by the walls. At night, there were sounds that distressed him, crying, screaming, or long stretches of silence that felt even worse. He swiftly learned never to inquire about these things. Margaret usually kept around 25 people in the compound at any given time. Though the specific individuals frequently changed, she acquired them through diverse methods, purchasing those with specific physical characteristics, accepting people other owners wanted to discard, and occasionally bringing in people from her main plantation when they exhibited traits she wished to examine. These individuals resided in communal quarters, sleeping on straw pallets, and were provided adequate food and housing, but were kept in total isolation from the outside world. Margaret maintained meticulous records on every person, measurements, health status, known family history, and specific traits she deemed either desirable or undesirable. She orchestrated pairings with cold calculation, keeping charts that tracked which combinations produced children with which characteristics. Over 13 years, she had documented numerous births. However, the records also contained something more sinister, a high rate of mortality, particularly among infants, and a significant number of disappearances. The reality behind these disappearances was perhaps the most horrifying aspect. When children were born with what Margaret labeled degenerate characteristics, severe birth defects, or significant health issues, they did not survive for long. Her record stated that they failed to thrive or expired due to natural weakness. Yet witnesses who came forward following Margaret's death offered different accounts. They described infants being removed shortly after birth and never seen again. They spoke of a small cemetery deep within the pine forest marked only by numbered wooden stakes. They described a copper-lined basement where Margaret preserved biological specimens in jars of alcohol, including some that were unsettlingly human. Thomas knew none of this during his early years. His existence revolved around his room, the schoolroom, the examination room, and occasionally the yard where Margaret permitted him supervised exercise. She meticulously managed his health, ensuring proper nutrition, fresh air, and physical activity. However, this was livestock management, not empathy. As Thomas neared his 14th birthday in 1857, Margaret's lessons evolved. She began explaining reproductive biology in explicit detail, using anatomical charts and preserved specimens. She discussed conception, gestation, and birth with clinical precision. She explained genetic inheritance with increasing focus on his unique traits. "You represent something remarkable," she told him during one lesson, her eyes examining him with calculated intensity. Your albinism is a pure expression of recessive characteristics. If correctly paired with subjects possessing complementary traits, the offspring would be invaluable for understanding hereditary mechanisms. You are not merely a subject to be observed, Thomas. You are the key to the next phase of this research. Thomas was intelligent enough to comprehend the horror she was suggesting, and the knowledge filled him with profound terror. But he had no escape. The compound was encircled by miles of forest patrolled by overseers with dogs. Even if he managed to escape, where would an albino teenage boy go in 1857 Georgia? He would be captured immediately, returned, and severely punished. Margaret owned him as completely as she owned her furniture, and the law fully upheld her absolute right to do anything she wished. However, during his recovery from a serious case of pneumonia in the spring of 1858, something unforeseen took place. Augustus, the driver, began to speak to him during supply drop-offs. These were brief exchanges, never more than a few sentences, and always when Margaret was elsewhere. Augustus would inquire about Thomas's well-being, comment on the weather, and share small details about the world outside the compound. These brief human interactions, following years of isolation and clinical scrutiny, deeply affected Thomas. One afternoon in June 1858, while Thomas was recuperating in the yard, Augustus brought supplies and lingered. "You know she won't stop," he murmured quietly. "Whatever her plan is, she won't quit. But you're smarter than most. You've been studying her books. Maybe you can figure out something she can't." Before Thomas could reply, Augustus quickly moved away, but the remark planted a seed in Thomas's mind. For 3 years he had been passive, resigning himself to his fate because he saw no alternative. Yet Augustus was correct. He was literate. He had access to Margaret's library. He understood her theories better than she realized, and if he was cautious, patient, and clever, he might find a way to leverage that knowledge. As summer commenced and Thomas regained his strength, Margaret intensified her lessons. She informed him that the following year, when he reached 15, he would commence the next phase. She had selected several women within the compound with what she termed optimal characteristics, and Thomas would be paired with them to produce children who could be studied from birth. She delivered this news with clinical detachment, as if discussing the rotation of crops rather than the systematic abuse of a teenage boy. Thomas listened, nodded, and kept silent. But beneath his pale eyes, a fundamental shift had occurred. He was no longer just a docile subject. He was plotting. And as he lay in his room each night, he began to realize that knowledge itself could be a weapon. Margaret had educated him as a part of her experiment, never considering that this education might equip him with the tools to resist. It was a lapse in judgment that would eventually cause the downfall of everything she had meticulously constructed. The autumn of 1858 introduced an unforeseen complication. Dr. Harrison Pembroke arrived at Belmont on October 12th, unannounced, carrying a letter of introduction from the Medical Society of Charleston. Pembroke, a rising figure in Southern medical circles, had become engrossed with hereditary pathologies. He had heard rumors of Margaret's private research facility and traveled from South Carolina specifically to meet her. Margaret received him at the main house, serving tea while carefully evaluating this unexpected visitor. Pembroke was 42, tall and slender, with sharp features and hands that constantly gestured while he spoke. He had studied medicine in Philadelphia before returning to Charleston to establish a practice. However, his true passion was research. He presented Margaret with his published papers on hereditary illness, his theories concerning racial traits, and his belief that scientific breeding could perfect the human species. "The future of medicine lies not in treating illness after it emerges," Pembroke passionately explained, "but in preventing weak bloodlines from reproducing. Imagine a world where hereditary diseases are eliminated through careful selection, where each generation is stronger than the last. This can be achieved through systematic breeding principles." Margaret listened, rapidly calculating her next move. Pembroke presented both an opportunity and a threat. An opportunity because his medical expertise surpassed hers and could potentially accelerate her research. A threat because he might uncover the full extent of her experiments and respond with moral outrage. Many physicians abstractly endorsed eugenic theories, but might balk at their practical application. "Your concepts are intriguing, Dr. Pembroke," she responded cautiously. "I have kept some observations on heredity among the enslaved population here. Nothing as systematic as your research, perhaps, but enough to convince me that principles of animal husbandry are applicable to human beings. Pembroke leaned forward, his eyes shining. I would be honored to view your work. Perhaps I could offer observations that might advance both our studies. After a long moment of contemplation, Margaret made her decision. Very well, Doctor. I will show you my facility, but I must insist on absolute discretion. The work is scientifically sound, but the general public lacks the education to grasp its importance. You have my word as a gentleman and a man of science, Pembroke replied solemnly. The next morning, Margaret guided Pembroke to the compound. As they walked through the pine forest, she elaborated on her theories and methods in greater detail than she had ever shared. She described 13 years of controlled breeding, meticulous documentation, and efforts to isolate and predict hereditary traits. Pembroke listened with rapt attention, occasionally interjecting questions that demonstrated his medical knowledge and genuine interest. When they reached the compound, Margaret first took him to the building housing her records. Shelf after shelf was filled with journals, charts, and diagrams documenting births, deaths, measurements, and observations spanning over a decade. Pembroke examined them with increasing excitement. Extraordinary, he murmured, examining a journal from 1847 documenting 3 generations of one family line. You have maintained consistency across years. The level of detail is remarkable. He paused, reading more closely. Though I must say the infant mortality rate appears quite high, 37% in this cohort alone. Margaret had anticipated this query. Weak specimens, she responded smoothly. Those with obvious deformities or constitutional weaknesses suggesting degenerate heredity. I have maintained detailed autopsy records on each case. The losses, while regrettable, provide valuable data about which characteristics breed true and which represent hereditary failure. Pembroke nodded slowly, though a hint of discomfort crossed his face. But his scientific curiosity quickly overcame his moral reservations. And you have preserved specimens? They then descended into the copper-lined basement where Margaret kept her collection. Rows of glass jars lined wooden shelves, each containing biological specimens suspended in a clear fluid. Pembroke examined them with professional interest, taking notes. Most were organs or tissue samples, but several jars contained small, fully formed bodies. Infants no more than a few days old, their tiny faces frozen in expressions that suggested their deaths had not been peaceful. You conducted autopsies yourself? Pembroke asked. I had assistance from a physician in Savannah initially, until he passed in 1851. Since then, I have performed examinations independently. My anatomical knowledge is largely self-taught, but adequate for the purpose, more than adequate. Pembroke straightened, closing his notebook. Mrs. Dunor, what you have accomplished here represents a singular achievement. The scope, duration, and meticulousness are extraordinary. You absolutely must publish these findings. Margaret demurred. Publication is impossible. The public would never comprehend this. I am content to continue my research privately, advancing knowledge for its own sake. Then perhaps we could collaborate, Pembroke proposed. I could analyze your data, contribute my medical expertise, and assist in designing supplementary studies. With proper methodology, we could generate findings that would revolutionize the understanding of human heredity. Margaret pondered this carefully. Collaboration meant relinquishing some control and significantly increasing the risk of exposure. However, the prospect of achieving a genuine scientific breakthrough was powerfully tempting. Let me show you the project's crown jewel, she finally conceded. She guided him to Thomas's room. The boy was seated at his table, engrossed in a medical textbook. He looked up as the door opened, his pale eyes shifting from Margaret to the stranger. At 15, Thomas had grown considerably, though he remained slight. His white blonde hair was closely trimmed, and his pallid skin appeared almost luminous in the afternoon light. This is Subject 0, Margaret announced with evident pride. A pure albino acquired 4 years ago specifically for this research. I have documented every facet of his development, provided extensive instruction in anatomy and natural philosophy, and carefully maintained his health in preparation for the breeding phase. Pembroke stared with undisguised fascination. He approached slowly and spent the next 30 minutes conducting a thorough examination, while Thomas sat still, enduring the stranger's probing hands with the passive acceptance learned during his years in the compound. Pembroke measured, palpated, and examined Thomas's eyes with various instruments. He asked questions about his health history, vision, and light sensitivity. Thomas responded in a quiet, educated voice that clearly surprised Pembroke. "You have taught him to speak correctly," Pembroke observed, "and to read, an interesting choice." "Education serves multiple objectives," Margaret explained. "It allows him to grasp the research's significance, ensuring cooperation. It provides data on the intellectual capacity of albino subjects, and practically as he matures, he will need to sufficiently understand the breeding protocols to participate effectively." Pembroke straightened. "Participate in breeding protocols. You intend to essentially use him as a stud when he reaches appropriate maturity?" "Yes, he is now 15. I plan to commence the breeding phase within 6 months, pairing him with carefully selected women to produce offspring that can be studied from conception through development. The hereditary transmission of albinism is poorly understood. By controlling parentage and documenting results across multiple pairings, we can determine whether it breeds true and what other characteristics are linked to it." For the first time, Pembroke looked genuinely uncomfortable. His eyes moved from Margaret to Thomas and back again. "He is still quite young. Enslaved boys his age father children regularly throughout the South," Margaret replied coolly. "There is nothing unusual in this. And unlike field workers forced into casual unions, Subject Zero will participate in controlled, documented breeding for scientific purposes. The context is entirely different." Pembroke remained silent for a prolonged moment, his scientific zeal warring with his residual moral sensibilities. But Margaret had correctly predicted that his intellectual ambition would prevail. "What guarantees do I have that the offspring will be properly documented?" he finally asked. "Without complete records from conception through maturity, the data loses much of its value." "I have maintained such records for 13 years, Margaret stated. "I have no intention of relaxing my standards now. Every conception will be documented, every pregnancy monitored, every birth recorded in detail. Children will be raised here where their development can be observed systematically. You will have complete access to all records." "Then I accept your offer of collaboration," Pembroke stated. "I can visit monthly to conduct examinations and contribute my medical expertise. In exchange, I ask only to receive credit when these findings are eventually published." They shook hands to seal the arrangement. Thomas observed this exchange in silence, understanding with perfect clarity that his fate had just been decided. The slim hope he had harbored, that Margaret might delay or abandon her plans, had vanished. She had received validation from a respected physician who not only accepted her work but wished to join it. There would be no postponement. After Pembroke left that evening, Margaret visited Thomas's room. "Dr. Pembroke is impressed with our work," she said. "He believes we are on the verge of a significant scientific breakthrough. You should feel privileged to participate in research of such importance." Thomas remained silent. "I expect your cooperation," Margaret continued, her voice becoming stern. "You have been given advantages no enslaved person could ever dream of: education, adequate food and shelter, protection from the brutalities of fieldwork. I have invested considerable resources in your development. The time has come for you to fulfill the purpose for which you were acquired." Still, Thomas said nothing. Margaret studied him briefly, then departed, locking the door behind her. In the darkness, Thomas finally permitted himself to feel the full weight of his despair. He was 15 years old, utterly alone, trapped in a nightmare disguised as science. And now a reputable physician had validated everything Margaret believed, ensuring the horror would continue and intensify. But Thomas had spent 4 years reading Margaret's books, studying her theories and understanding her way of thinking. He had begun to notice something that neither Margaret nor Pembroke seemed to acknowledge: their grand theories about heredity. Their predictions about which traits would appear in the offspring were wrong more often than right. Margaret's charts showed disappointing results. Children who did not match predictions, characteristics that appeared or vanished without explanation. Margaret blamed these failures on insufficient data or hidden hereditary factors. But Thomas, reading the same texts and understanding the same concepts, had begun to suspect something more profound: that heredity was far more complex than anyone yet understood, and that Margaret's confidence in controlling and predicting it was an illusion. This realization gave him something he previously lacked: hope. Not hope for an escape which felt impossible, but hope that Margaret's experiment might fail on its own terms, that the results might prove so inconsistent that even she would be compelled to recognize its limitations. It was a fragile hope, dependent on outcomes many years in the future. But it was something. And as Thomas lay in his narrow bed that October night, he made a silent vow. He would comply with Margaret's demands because he had no alternative. But he would observe, learn, and retain. And if he survived long enough, if Margaret's experiment ultimately failed, as he suspected it would, he would ensure the world discovered what occurred in this hidden location. Harrison Pembroke returned to Belmont on November 18, 1858, bringing medical instruments, journals, and supplies he considered essential for what he termed the proper scientific documentation of the breeding phase. Margaret welcomed him warmly, relieved to have secured not just a collaborator but someone who completely shared her vision. Thomas had been thoroughly prepared for Pembroke's visit. Margaret had explained, using anatomical charts and breeding manuals in clinical detail, what was expected, illustrating the procedures. She had selected 3 women from the compound's population, all in their late teens or early 20s, all exhibiting what she labeled optimal physical characteristics. She showed Thomas their documentation, detailed measurements, family histories, and health assessments. She explained he would be paired with each woman in succession, that conceptions and pregnancies would be rigorously monitored, and that the resulting children would remain at the compound for systematic study. Thomas listened with a face carefully blank, concealing the revulsion and terror he felt inside. He understood that resistance was futile. Margaret held absolute power over everyone in the compound, and Pembroke's involvement added medical authority to her demands. The first woman Margaret chose was named Eliza. She was 19, tall and slender, with features Margaret's records described as refined type, suggesting a mixed heritage favorable for observing albinism transmission. Eliza had been at the compound for 2 years, taken from Belmont's main plantation after giving birth to a child Margaret wanted to study. That child, a daughter, had been removed shortly after birth, and Eliza never saw her again. The ordeal left her withdrawn and deeply traumatized, although Margaret's notes simply characterized her as a compliant subject with minimal resistance. Margaret brought Eliza to Thomas's room on a cold November afternoon. Pembroke waited outside, ready to enter after the time Margaret estimated as sufficient had passed. She explained to both of them what was expected, her voice carrying no more emotion than if she were giving instructions for housekeeping. Then she left them alone, locking the door from the outside. For a long while, neither moved nor spoke. They stood on opposite sides of the small room, 2 terrified young people trapped in a nightmare. Neither had the power to escape. Finally, Eliza broke the silence. "I know you," she said softly. "I've seen you from the window sometimes. The white boy she keeps locked up. Been here long as me, maybe longer?" Thomas nodded. 4 years. "What'd she make you do?" "Study. Read her books, learn about—" He gestured helplessly at the anatomical charts on the wall. Eliza moved to the window. "My baby was a girl. Pretty little thing. Mrs. Dunor took her away that same night. Told me the baby died, but I heard her crying for days after in some other part of the building. Then I didn't hear nothing no more." Her voice was flat, drained of emotion by grief too immense to fully articulate. "You think that baby really died?" Thomas did not answer, unsure what truth would be kinder. Instead, he simply said, "I'm sorry." Eliza turned to face him, her eyes holding profound sorrow. "You and me, we got no choices here. She owns us. She can make us do whatever she wants, so I guess we do what she says and maybe we survive. That's all there is." What transpired next in that locked room will not be detailed explicitly, as some horrors need not be rendered explicit to be understood. It is sufficient to say that 2 young people, stripped of all agency, attempted to retain some shred of dignity in a profoundly degrading situation. When Margaret unlocked the door an hour later, followed by Pembroke carrying medical instruments, both Thomas and Eliza had been changed in ways that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Pembroke conducted an examination of Eliza that was invasive and humiliating, meticulously documenting everything in his notebook with clinical precision. He discussed his findings with Margaret as if Eliza were absent, using medical terminology that utterly dehumanized her. Then he dismissed her, and she was escorted back to her sleeping quarters. Thomas remained, and Pembroke subjected him to a similar examination and questioning, recording observations about his physical response, emotional state, and comprehension of what had just occurred. Margaret and Pembroke repeated this procedure with the second woman, Sarah, on November 25th. Sarah was 18, having been at the compound for only 6 months. Purchased from a plantation near Augusta, because Margaret's records indicated desirable hereditary traits. Unlike Eliza, whose trauma led to resignation, Sarah's manifested as fury. When Margaret explained what was required, Sarah refused outright, her voice trembling with anger and fear. "You can beat me, sell me, kill me," Sarah declared, "but I ain't doing this. This ain't right, and you know it." Margaret was unmoved. "You have no right to refuse. You are property purchased specifically for this purpose. Your cooperation is required." "Then you're going to have to force me." Margaret nodded to the overseer. "Take her to the isolation room. No food until she reconsiders." Sarah was locked in a small, windowless basement room, receiving only water and a single small piece of bread daily. She remained there for 6 days. On the second day, Margaret visited to ask if she had reconsidered. Sarah, weakened but defiant, refused. On the 4th day, Margaret visited with Pembroke, who explained in medical terms the damage prolonged starvation would cause, emphasizing the permanent harm she was inflicting on herself through pointless resistance. Sarah wept but did not yield. On the 6th day, Margaret adopted a different tactic. She brought Eliza to the isolation room and made her describe what had happened, stressing that Eliza had survived, had not been physically harmed, and that continued resistance would only prolong Sarah's suffering without altering the outcome. Eliza, exhausted and broken, delivered this message as instructed, though her voice carried an apology Margaret had not scripted. Sarah finally surrendered. She was too weak to walk, so the overseer carried her to Thomas's room where the process was repeated. Pembroke documented everything with clinical detachment, noting, "Subject's physical condition compromised by resistance. Recommend improved nutritional preparation for future pairings." The third woman, Hannah, witnessed what happened to Sarah and offered no resistance when her turn came in early December. She was 21, at the compound for 3 years, and had long ago learned that survival necessitated absolute submission. She complied with Margaret's every demand, her face an expressionless mask, her eyes fixed on some distant point beyond the walls. Afterward, Pembroke noted with satisfaction that subject demonstrated optimal compliance, suggesting effective conditioning protocols. Thomas endured these weeks in a state of numb dissociation. Each night, locked in his room, he stared at the ceiling and attempted to separate his mind from his body, to preserve some core of his self untouched by what Margaret forced him to do. He read obsessively, losing himself in detailed anatomical illustrations and breeding charts, anything to suppress his thoughts. Meanwhile, he diligently monitored Margaret's records whenever he could access them, noting the increasing inconsistencies between her predictions and the actual outcomes of previous experiments. Margaret, conversely, was triumphant. She had successfully commenced the breeding phase with Subject 0, meticulously documenting every detail with Pembroke's help. She calculated probabilities of conception, estimated gestation periods, and designed observation protocols for the anticipated pregnancies. In her journal, she wrote extensive entries forecasting that the offspring would yield unprecedented insights into the inheritance of albinism. But nature operated independently. Of the 3 women, only Eliza conceived. Sarah's and Hannah's bodies, under the duress of trauma and harsh conditions, failed to sustain conception, despite subsequent repeated pairings in the months that followed. Margaret ascribed this to constitutional weakness, recording it as data that supported her theories. She did not consider, or chose to disregard, the notion that profound trauma could impact fertility. Eliza's pregnancy was monitored with obsessive attention. Margaret and Pembroke examined her weekly, measuring her abdomen, listening for the fetal heartbeat, and documenting every detail of her gestation. They engaged in debates about their predictions. Would the child exhibit albinism? What would the skin color be? The eye color? They discussed these questions with scientific fervor, apparently oblivious to Eliza's deepening despair as her pregnancy progressed. Thomas occasionally saw Eliza from his window, or during the brief periods when compound residents were allowed in the yard. Her abdomen expanded through the winter and into the spring. She moved slowly, heavily, her face gaunt with exhaustion and something deeper. Once their eyes met across the yard, and Thomas witnessed a grief so profound it stopped his breath. She was mourning her child before its birth, knowing the fate awaiting any baby born in this place. As Eliza's due date in May 1859 neared, Margaret prepared the compound's medical room with extra supplies. She had attended numerous births within the compound over the years, and she approached this one with specific anticipation. Pembroke made arrangements to be present, bringing specialized instruments and promising to conduct an immediate examination of the newborn to document its initial characteristics. The birth occurred on May 17, 1859. After 18 hours of labor, Margaret and Pembroke were in attendance throughout, treating Eliza's suffering as an inconvenient but necessary element of data collection. When the baby finally emerged, a girl weighing just over 6 pounds, Margaret's first act was not to comfort the exhausted mother, but to examine the infant's skin and eyes under bright lamplight. The baby was not albino. Her skin was light brown, her eyes dark and her hair black. She appeared entirely healthy, crying vigorously when Pembroke conducted his examination. Margaret's immediate reaction was visible disappointment. After 4 years of preparation, carefully selecting and educating Subject Zero, and meticulously orchestrating this breeding experiment, the primary characteristic she had hoped to study had not appeared in the first offspring. Recessive trait, Pembroke observed, making notes. As expected, requires both parents to carry the characteristic. The mother obviously does not carry albinism genes. Therefore, the offspring shows normal pigmentation. We would need multiple generations and careful selection to isolate the recessive expression. Margaret nodded, her mind instantly calculating the next steps. Subject Zero will need to be paired with his own female offspring once they reach maturity. That is the only way to increase the probability of albino expression in subsequent generations. This child will be designated Generation 1, Female 1. When she reaches approximately 15 years of age, she will be bred back to Subject Zero. Eliza, lying utterly exhausted on the birthing bed, overheard this conversation. The implications were clear enough. Even through her pain and fatigue, they intended to take her daughter, raise her in this compound, and eventually force her into the same nightmare Eliza had just endured. This realization produced a sound from Eliza that was not exactly a scream, nor quite a sob, but something more primal, a sound of absolute despair that would haunt Thomas, who heard it from his locked room, for the rest of his life. Margaret allowed Eliza to nurse the baby for 1 week, just long enough to establish feeding. Then on May 24th, the infant was removed and taken to a separate room where a wet nurse, another enslaved woman, would provide care under Margaret's supervision. Eliza was returned to the general population of the compound, her body still recovering from birth, her arms empty, her milk painfully drying because she had no baby to feed. The compound became eerily quiet and tense after that week in May. The sounds from other buildings almost entirely ceased. Even Margaret seemed subdued, though she maintained her routines and continued documenting observations with mechanical precision. Something had shifted. Some balance had been broken, though Thomas couldn't pinpoint exactly what. What no one knew was that Eliza had made a decision during that week she was permitted to hold her daughter. A decision born from a love so fierce it led to a terrible action. On the 6th night, when darkness was complete and the compound was quiet, Eliza did something that ensured her daughter would never be used in Margaret Denor's experiment. The wet nurse discovered both of them the next morning. Eliza's arms wrapped around the tiny body that had ceased breathing sometime in the night. The specific details were never recorded, the method never documented. Margaret simply noted in her records, Generation 1, Female 1 expired due to unknown cause. Subject Eliza subsequently disposed of as unreliable for further breeding protocols. What disposed of entailed was never explained in the documents, but Eliza was never seen again in the compound after that day. And in the small cemetery deep within the pine forest, a witness who came forward decades later recalled digging 2 graves that week in May. Not one, a larger grave and a smaller one, marked only with wooden stakes that eventually rotted away, leaving no physical trace that either of them had ever existed. The summer of 1859 brought oppressive heat to Chatham County, and with it came an unexpected visitor who would change everything. Dr. Samuel Hargrave from Atlanta arrived at Belmont on July 8th, accompanied by a young medical assistant named Robert. Chen Hargrave had been corresponding with Margaret about her research after reading one of Pembroke's published papers that made vague references to systematic hereditary studies being conducted in Georgia. Intrigued, Hargrave had written to Margaret requesting permission to visit, and she had agreed, hoping to replace the increasingly unreliable Pembroke with a more stable collaborator. Robert Chen was 24 years old, the son of immigrants who had come to San Francisco during the gold rush before eventually settling in Georgia. He was assisting Hargrave with research for a book on human anatomical variation across different populations. Chen approached the visit to Belmont with professional curiosity, expecting to see interesting documentation of hereditary patterns. What he found instead would haunt him for the remainder of his life. Margaret granted them the same tour she had given Pembroke: the records room with its shelves of journals and charts, the basement containing its preserved specimens, and finally, the introduction to Subject Zero. But while Pembroke had responded with scientific fervor tempered by unease, Chen's reaction was one of immediate and profound horror. As Margaret detailed her methods, the forced pairings, the systematic breeding, the high infant mortality rate, Chen's face became progressively paler. When she described her plans to breed Thomas with his own offspring upon their maturity, Chen could no longer remain silent. "Mrs. Dunor," he said carefully, his voice strained with barely controlled emotion, "what you describe is not research. It is systematic brutality. These are human beings, not livestock. No scientific knowledge could justify such violations of human dignity." Margaret grew rigid, her face hardening. "You are young and swayed by sentimental notions that have no place in scientific inquiry. These are enslaved people, legally my property, whose reproduction I control absolutely under the law. I am using that legal authority to advance human knowledge. Your moral objections are irrelevant." "The law does not determine morality," Chen replied steadily. "Despite the danger of contradicting a wealthy woman in her own home, what is legal can still be profoundly wrong. What you are doing here is wrong, Mrs. Dunor. History will judge this harshly." Hargrave attempted to intervene, but Chen was resolute. "There is no theoretical framework that justifies treating human beings as breeding stock. I have seen enough. I will not participate in this, and I strongly advise you, Dr. Hargrave, to withdraw as well." Margaret instantly ordered both men off her property. They left within the hour, but not before Chen had a crucial interaction. While waiting for Hargrave to gather his belongings, Chen wandered down the hallway where Thomas's room was situated. Through the door's small window, he saw the pale boy seated at his table reading. Something about the scene struck Chen as unbearably sad. He knocked softly on the door. Thomas looked up, startled. Visitors never knocked. He approached the door cautiously. "What is your name?" Chen asked through the window. "Thomas, sir. How long have you been here?" "5 years, sir." "Do you want to leave?" The question was so sudden that Thomas struggled to answer. After a long pause, he simply said, "Yes." Chen nodded, committing the boy's face to memory. "I will remember you, Thomas. I promise I will remember." Then Hargrave called for him, and Chen was forced to depart. Thomas watched through the window as the two men left. He didn't grasp the full significance of that exchange, but something in Chen's eyes planted a seed of hope. Chen and Hargrave argued during their return journey to Atlanta. Hargrave tried to defend Margaret's work using scientific rationale, but Chen's moral certainty eventually wore him down. By the time they reached Atlanta, Hargrave reluctantly agreed that the events at Belmont violated ethical standards. Though he refused to take action against Margaret, Chen had no such hesitation. Within days of returning to Atlanta, he began writing letters to medical societies, abolitionist organizations, and newspapers, describing what he had witnessed at Belmont in meticulous detail. He documented everything: the forced breeding, the preserved infant specimens, the systematic exploitation, and most importantly, he described Thomas, the albino boy, locked in a room and being groomed for breeding experiments. The response was not what Chen had hoped for. In late 1859, with sectional tensions escalating toward war, most institutions were unwilling to investigate the internal operations of a Georgia plantation, especially based on the word of a young Chinese medical assistant making extraordinary claims against a wealthy white woman. The medical societies thanked him for his concern, but took no action. Newspapers declined to publish his accounts, citing a lack of corroborating evidence. Even abolitionist groups, though sympathetic, had limited resources. Frustrated but undeterred, Chen made a fateful decision. On December 12, 1859, just days after John Brown's execution sent shockwaves through the South, Chen traveled back to Chatham County. He did not approach Belmont directly. Instead, he began quietly interviewing people in the area, drivers, tradesmen, overseers from other plantations, and free blacks in Savannah who might have heard rumors from enslaved people at Belmont. Slowly and carefully, he compiled testimonies that corroborated his observations. Margaret learned of Chen's investigation in late December, when an overseer from a neighboring plantation mentioned that a Chinese man had been asking questions about Belmont's slave population. Margaret immediately grasped the threat. She had maintained her compound in secrecy for 14 years through isolation, intimidation, and the general unwillingness of anyone to interfere with a plantation owner's business. But Chen represented something new, an outsider with no financial stake in the system, no social ties to Georgia's plantation society, and a moral conviction strong enough to override practical concerns. Margaret's response was calculated and ruthless. She could not simply have Chen killed, as his disappearance would attract the exact attention she needed to avoid. Instead, she began destroying evidence. She burned journals containing the most damning details, disposed of the most disturbing preserved specimens, and reduced the compound's population by selling people to distant plantations where they could not easily be questioned. Most significantly, she made preparations to relocate Thomas entirely, possibly to property she owned in Alabama. But Margaret made a critical error. In her haste to eliminate evidence, she failed to account for Augustus, her longtime driver, who had witnessed 14 years of horror at Belmont and had finally reached his breaking point. Augustus had seen Eliza and her baby buried in the forest. He had transported countless people to the compound who were never seen again. He had delivered supplies for Margaret's experiments and remained silent because he believed he had no alternative. But Chen's investigation gave him something he hadn't had before: hope that someone might actually listen. On January 15, 1860, Augustus made contact with Chen through an intermediary in Savannah. They met secretly in a warehouse near the docks, and Augustus told Chen everything he knew. He described the hidden compound, the forced breeding, the high mortality rate, and the cemetery in the forest with its numbered stakes. He provided names of people who had disappeared, the dates they were taken to the compound, and details about Margaret's methods and her obsessive documentation. Most importantly, he drew a map showing the location of the compound and described how to access it undetected. Chen now had corroborating testimony from someone who had been inside Belmont for years. It was exactly what he needed to force authorities to act. He traveled to Savannah and presented his evidence to the county sheriff, a man named William Pritchard. Chen presented everything: his own observations, Augustus's testimony, and the physical evidence that still remained at the compound, despite Margaret's efforts to destroy it. Pritchard was in a difficult position. Margaret Denore was wealthy, influential, and well-connected. Investigating her based on accusations from a Chinese medical assistant and an enslaved driver could ruin his career if the charges were unfounded or exaggerated. However, Chen's documentation was specific and detailed, and if even half of his allegations were true, Pritchard couldn't ignore it without becoming complicit. On January 23, 1860, Sheriff Pritchard, accompanied by 2 deputies and Robert Chen, arrived at Belmont with a court order to inspect the compound. Margaret met them at the main house, her face a mask of cold fury, but she was forced to comply with the court order. She led them down the narrow road through the pine forest to the hidden buildings, and what they found there confirmed Chen's worst descriptions. The compound population had been reduced to just 8 people, all appearing malnourished and traumatized. The records room was mostly empty, with ash still visible in the fireplace where Margaret had incinerated journals. Yet she hadn't destroyed everything. Pembroke's detailed medical notes remained, documenting forced pairings and pregnancy observations with clinical precision. The basement still held dozens of preserved specimens, including several that were clearly human infants. And most damningly, they found Thomas locked in his room, 15 years old, and able to articulate exactly what had happened to him over the past 5 years. Pritchard was horrified. He had expected evidence of harsh treatment or perhaps questionable breeding practices, but nothing had prepared him for the systematic nature of Margaret's experiment. He placed Margaret under house arrest pending formal charges and ordered the compound closed. The 8 remaining residents were temporarily relocated to the county poorhouse, while authorities determined their legal status. Thomas, due to his unique circumstances and ability to testify, was placed under the protection of the court. Margaret's response was immediate and calculated. She hired the best lawyers money could buy, men whose careers were built on defending plantation owners against accusations of cruelty. Their strategy was simple. Everything Margaret had done was legal under Georgia law. Enslaved people were property, and owners had absolute discretion over their reproduction, living conditions, and treatment. The law explicitly granted Margaret the right to do everything Chen and Pritchard accused her of doing. The forced breeding, the medical experiments, and even the high infant mortality rate were all within her legal rights as a property owner. It was a defense that was likely to succeed. In 1860 Georgia, no jury would convict a wealthy white woman for actions that were technically legal, regardless of how morally repugnant they were. Chen knew this. Pritchard knew this. And Margaret's lawyers knew this. The case was likely to be dismissed before ever reaching trial. But then something unexpected occurred that changed everything. Harrison Pembroke, the physician who had collaborated with Margaret for over a year, came forward. He had been living in Charleston, drinking heavily, consumed by guilt over his participation in the experiment. When he learned of the investigation, something broke inside him. On February 8, 1860, Pembroke traveled to Savannah and provided testimony that corroborated every detail of Chen's accusations. More importantly, as a respected white physician, his testimony carried weight that Chen's and Augustus's did not. Pembroke described the forced pairings in graphic detail. He provided dates, names, and specific medical observations. He admitted his own participation and expressed profound remorse. He stated clearly that what happened at Belmont was not legitimate research, but systematic brutality disguised as science. His testimony was devastating, and it came from someone the court could not easily dismiss. With Pembroke's testimony added to the evidence, the case against Margaret became significantly stronger. However, Margaret's lawyers adjusted their strategy. They argued that even if all the allegations were true, it still did not constitute a crime under Georgia law. They were preparing to file motions to dismiss all charges when events outside Chatham County intervened in ways no one could have predicted. Just when we thought we understood the full scope of Margaret Dunour's experiments, the investigation uncovered something even more disturbing. If you have been following this dark journey into one of Georgia's most suppressed historical horrors, this is the moment when everything unravels. Hit that like button if this story has kept you on the edge of your seat. Share it with someone who appreciates true historical mysteries, and make sure you are subscribed so you don't miss the conclusion. Now, let me tell you how the truth about Belmont finally came to light, though not in any way that would bring real justice. In March 1860, as Margaret's lawyers maneuvered to have all charges dismissed, Chen made one final effort to expose the full scope of the Belmont horrors. He had been investigating one persistent question that no one had adequately answered. What happened to all the people who had disappeared from the compound over 14 years? Augustus had mentioned a cemetery in the forest with numbered wooden stakes, but he had never been allowed close enough to determine how many graves it contained. On March 14, 1860, Chen, accompanied by Sheriff Pritchard and 2 deputies, searched the pine forest behind the compound until they found the cemetery Augustus had described. What they discovered was far worse than anyone had imagined. The wooden stakes had mostly rotted away, but careful examination of the ground revealed disturbances indicating at least 47 separate grave sites. 47 people buried in unmarked graves in a hidden cemetery. Their deaths never reported, their names never recorded in any official document. Pritchard ordered excavations of several graves to determine the cause of death. What they found was horrifying. Multiple infant remains, some showing signs of physical deformities, others appearing entirely healthy, several adult remains that forensic examination suggested had died of malnutrition or untreated illness, and most disturbing, 3 adult remains that showed evidence of violence, broken bones that had never healed, skull fractures and injuries that could not have been accidental. This discovery changed everything. Margaret could argue that breeding enslaved people was legal, and that high infant mortality was unfortunate but not criminal. But murder was murder regardless of the victim's legal status. The evidence of violence in those graves suggested that some people in the compound had not simply died from neglect or harsh conditions, they had been killed. When confronted with this evidence, Margaret maintained that she had no knowledge of any violence. She claimed that if anyone had been killed, it must have been the work of overseers acting without her authorization or conflicts among the enslaved people themselves. Her lawyers contended that without any witnesses or documentation proving Margaret personally committed or authorized any killings, the murder charges could not be upheld. But Margaret had failed to consider one person, Hannah, the third woman forced to pair with Thomas, who had endured the experiment through absolute submission. Hannah was one of the 8 people removed when the compound was closed. She had initially remained silent during questioning, due to trauma and fear. However, upon learning about the cemetery and the evidence of violence, something within her shifted. On March 22, 1860, Hannah came forward with testimony that would finally break through Margaret's legal defenses. Hannah described personally witnessing Margaret administering poison to an infant born with severe deformities. She recounted seeing Margaret strike a woman who had refused breeding protocols with such force that the woman collapsed and never recovered consciousness. She described Margaret ordering an overseer to dispose of a man who had become too ill to be useful for the breeding experiments. Hannah provided specific dates, names, and precise details that could be corroborated against the grave sites and Margaret's surviving records. Hannah's testimony was given at tremendous personal risk. As an enslaved woman testifying against a white property owner, she had no legal standing in Georgia courts. Her testimony would ordinarily be inadmissible, but the circumstances were unusual enough, and the physical evidence compelling enough that the judge permitted her testimony to be entered into the record, though he stipulated it could not alone secure a conviction. Margaret's lawyers viciously attacked Hannah's credibility, arguing that enslaved people routinely fabricated stories to harm their owners, that Hannah's testimony was fueled by resentment over being used in the breeding experiments, and that nothing she said could be trusted. The legal battle extended through March and into April 1860, with both sides gathering evidence and expert testimony. Then on April 12, 1861, Confederate forces fired on Fort Sumter and the Civil War began. Within weeks, all attention in Georgia shifted entirely to the war effort. Margaret's case, which had been slowly advancing through the legal system, was indefinitely postponed. Sheriff Pritchard was called up for military duty. The judge presiding over the case left to serve as a military advisor. The county records office, which had been compiling evidence, closed as staff enlisted or fled. Margaret, still technically under house arrest but no longer actively prosecuted, recognized an opportunity. In June 1861, she sold Belmont to a consortium of investors from Savannah, claiming she needed to relocate for health reasons. The sale included all property except the compound buildings, which Margaret had quietly dismantled between April and May, burning what she could and burying what she couldn't, scattering the evidence across the property. The buyers had no interest in the compound. They wanted only the productive farmland. Margaret relocated to Alabama to a small property near Mobile and vanished from the public record. The last confirmed sighting of her was in 1863, when a neighbor reported seeing an enormously obese woman living alone in a run-down house on the outskirts of Mobile. After that, nothing. She may have died during the war years, relocated further west, or simply disappeared into the chaos of a collapsing Confederacy. No death certificate was ever filed. No grave was ever identified. Margaret Dunor simply ceased to exist in any official record after 1863. Thomas, the boy at the center of Margaret's experiment, had a different destiny. When the compound closed in January 1860, he was placed under court protection. Robert Chen, feeling personally responsible for Thomas's welfare, arranged for him to be temporarily housed with a Quaker family in Savannah, who were opposed to slavery and agreed to care for him during the legal proceedings. When the war started and Margaret's case was postponed, Thomas remained with this family. The Quakers, Daniel and Abigail Hargrove, treated Thomas with genuine kindness, the first he had experienced since being sold at age 11. They continued his education, taught him practical skills, and most importantly, treated him as a human being rather than a specimen. When the Emancipation Proclamation was issued in 1863, Thomas was legally free. Although the practicalities of freedom for a 17-year-old albino boy in the middle of a war zone were complicated, Thomas stayed with the Hargrove family through the war and Reconstruction. He learned carpentry and became skilled enough to support himself. In 1869, at age 23, he married a free woman of color named Rebecca Williams, and they had 3 children together. None of the children exhibited albinism. All were healthy and lived to adulthood. Thomas worked as a carpenter in Savannah for over 30 years, living a quiet life and rarely speaking about his years at Belmont except to his wife, whom he trusted completely. Robert Chen continued his medical career, but the experience at Belmont changed him fundamentally. He abandoned his research into anatomical variation and instead focused on public health, working to improve medical care for poor communities in Atlanta. He maintained correspondence with Thomas for over 20 years. In his private journals, he wrote extensively about the ethical responsibilities of physicians and the dangers of scientific rationalization for cruelty. He died in 1892 at age 57, still haunted by what he had seen in that compound. Harrison Pembroke never recovered from his guilt over participating in Margaret's experiments. He continued practicing medicine in Charleston, but he drank heavily, and his mental health deteriorated. In 1867, he committed suicide by overdose of laudanum, leaving behind a note that referenced unforgivable sins committed in the name of science. His medical notes from Belmont, which had been entered as evidence in Margaret's case, were supposed to be sealed by the court, but were never returned to the court records. They disappeared sometime during the chaos of war and Reconstruction. Augustus, the driver who finally broke his silence and provided testimony that initiated the investigation, lived until 1879. He remained in Chatham County after the war, working as a freight driver. He was known for being quiet and sad, rarely smiling, as if he carried a burden that never lightened. He died at approximately 60 years old. His grave is marked with a simple stone that gives no hint of the courage it took for him to speak up against Margaret Denore. As for the 8 people removed from the compound in January 1860, their fates varied. Some died during the war years. Some disappeared into the chaos of Reconstruction. At least 2, including Hannah, remained in the Savannah area and lived into the 1870s. Hannah never married and had no children. She worked as a seamstress and lived alone, known in her neighborhood as a woman who seemed perpetually sad but was kind to children. She died in 1876, and at her request, she was buried under her real name, Hannah Freeman, in a cemetery for free blacks in Savannah. Her gravestone, which still exists, bears the inscription, "She survived what should have killed her." The property where Belmont stood changed ownership multiple times between 1861 and 1959. The main house burned down in 1883, cause unknown. The land was used for various purposes: farming, timber harvesting, and briefly as a hunting preserve. The compound area, deep within the pine forest, was mostly forgotten. Trees grew over the previously cleared spaces. The cemetery, its wooden marker stakes long since rotted away, became indistinguishable from the surrounding forest floor. In 1959, the state of Georgia approved the construction of a new highway that was slated to cut through the former Belmont property. During initial surveying in March 1959, construction workers unearthed the foundation of one of the compound buildings. Inside a sealed cavity in the foundation wall, they discovered a leather-bound journal, remarkably well preserved because it was completely protected from moisture and air. The journal was one of Margaret Denore's records from the Purification Project. It had been hidden rather than burned, possibly as a form of insurance or perhaps simply overlooked during Margaret's hasty destruction of evidence in 1861. The journal covered the years 1855 through 1859 and contained meticulous documentation of Thomas's acquisition, education, and eventual use in breeding experiments. It included measurements, observations, predictions, and chillingly clinical descriptions of the forced pairings. The construction workers who found the journal delivered it to the County Historical Society, unsure of the significance of their find. The Historical Society staff who first read it were horrified. They contacted state authorities, and the journal was ultimately transferred to the Georgia State Archives. A brief investigation was conducted, comparing the journal's contents against other historical records, census data, and court documents from the 1860 case against Margaret Denore. The investigation confirmed that everything in the journal appeared to be authentic. The dates matched known events. The names referenced in the journal corresponded to names from the court records. Physical descriptions of the compound matched the foundation remains being exposed by the highway construction. However, the investigation also revealed a disturbing finding. There had been a systematic effort to suppress information about the Belmont case, even after the war. Court records from Margaret's 1860 prosecution had been partially destroyed, supposedly during the war, though some documents appeared to have been removed deliberately, rather than lost to military action. Newspaper archives from Savannah in 1860 contained almost nothing about the case, despite the sensational allegations against a wealthy plantation owner. It seemed that even after Margaret fled, her family's wealth and influence had been used to minimize public knowledge of what had transpired. The Georgia State Archives classified the journal as a historically significant document but restricted public access to it for 10 years until 1969. Citing concerns about privacy and the sensitive nature of the content. When it was finally made available to researchers in 1969, it attracted attention from historians studying slavery, medical ethics, and eugenics in antebellum America. Several academic papers were published, analyzing Margaret's experiment as an extreme example of how eugenic thinking manifested in the antebellum South. The case became a teaching example in medical ethics courses, illustrating the dangers of scientific rationalization for cruelty. Yet mainstream historical narratives largely ignored it. It was too disturbing, too complicated, too uncomfortable to fit into simplified stories about antebellum Georgia. Thomas's descendants, who still lived in the Savannah area, learned about the journal's discovery through news coverage in 1969. Thomas had died in 1902 at age 56, having lived long enough to see his children grown and his grandchildren born. He had shared most of what happened at Belmont with his wife Rebecca, and she, in turn, had shared some of it with their children, though protecting them from the worst details. When the journal was made public, Thomas's grandchildren were in their 50s and 60s, and they finally comprehended the full scope of what their grandfather had endured. The family debated speaking publicly about their connection to the case, but ultimately decided against it. They were established in Savannah, had built good lives despite the barriers faced by African Americans in the Jim Crow South, and feared that association with such a notorious case might bring unwanted attention or harm. They maintained private family knowledge of Thomas's history, but did not contribute to public discussions of the Belmont case. The highway construction proceeded despite the discovery. The compound foundations were documented by archaeologists, then destroyed to make way for the road. The cemetery area was within the highway right-of-way and was excavated more thoroughly. Remains of 61 individuals were ultimately recovered, including adults and children ranging from infants to elderly. All were reinterred in a single plot in a Savannah cemetery marked with a stone that reads, "In memory of those who suffered at Belmont Plantation, 1842-1860, may they rest in peace and never be forgotten." This mystery shows us how easily scientific language can be used to justify profound cruelty, how legal authority can be wielded as a weapon against the powerless, and how institutions can fail to protect the most vulnerable. Margaret Dunoir's experiment was not an aberration. It was an extreme example of attitudes and practices that were widely accepted in her time. The belief that enslaved people could be treated as property, that reproduction could be controlled and manipulated, and that scientific advancement justified any method. These ideas were not unique to Margaret. What made her case unusual was only its systematic nature and eventual exposure. What do you think of this story? Do you believe Margaret Dunoir escaped justice, or did her guilt pursue her into whatever fate she met after 1863? Leave your comment below and share your thoughts. If you found this tale compelling and want more dark historical mysteries like this, subscribe to Liturgy of Fear. Hit that notification bell and share this video with someone who appreciates stories that illuminate the darkest corners of American history. Thank you for listening, and remember, the most terrifying horrors are often those that really happened. See you in the next video.